So we're going to start with this image texture node over here. So you just need to remember, you can go Shift A, click on texture, go down to image texture. And once you click on it, you would now have the image texture node to work with. And you can click on anywhere in this blank space and we can get started with it. So I'm going to zoom in a bit so that you can see this circular dots over here, and this is what we call sockets. So the sockets attached to the node is what we use to essentially plug in or connect two different nodes to create a network. So that's the idea. And how do you create a network with the sockets? All you just need to do is click on the circle dot over there, drag it and drop it to a similar socket. Now, why do I say similar socket? We have the color socket over here and we are plugging it into the base color principal BSDF socket over here. That's because can two work together except they agree? No, they can't. Anyway, so that's the idea of connecting two nodes. You have the alpha here. You can look out for alpha if you want to get to work with that, but we're just going to focus on the color. Now remember that I initially talked about textures, that we can use the color attributes, simple color attributes, and transfer that attribute to the objects to which it's applied. Now over here we have connected the image texture to the principal BSDF, just like the main node, and what we want to do now is to get in an image. So on my PC, I have an image that I can easily work with. So once you click on open, we can go to somewhere that we have, a file, an image file, select it and click on open image. And once you do that, you now have your image mapped to this object. How cool is that? Now let's say this box was made with thinner planks because it's sort of thick right now. We might want to stretch out the textures and, let it look sort of thinner. A way to do so is to go to the edit mode and work with the textures. So like we always do, we're just going to click on the box, click on tab, and we're in edit mode. But we need to move to one more place over here that says the editor type and switch to the UV editor. So to do so, just click on this icon over here and go over to UV editor, and if you scroll out a bit you will be able to see the UV maps that represents the stretched out box. Now there's this game I used to play when I was little, and let's say we had a cardboard. You're going to take a razor blade or scissors and cut the shape of the cardboard into something that looks like this, the 6 sides of the cube. And in this case, because it's kind of stretched out, it looks like a cuboid, and you now tape the edges together. That's the concept of UV maps. Now in this case, we have this box over here being represented with this stretched out 2D plane, and it shows us that the texture is projected to this flat surface, the flat representation of the box. We're making a lot of progress. Now the next thing we want to do is to sort of reduce the thickness of each of these planks over here. Now please pay attention. There is one simple traditional way to do so. Sometimes we just come over to the UV editor, we click on anywhere here, click on A to select everything, and click on S to scale, and we start stretching it out. And if you look closely at this, what is happening at the box over here, you see that it's actually becoming thinner. But this might not necessarily be the best way to go about this, because at the end of the day, we plan to use multiple softwares. We want to move our objects from Blender to another VR software, for example. And what we're going to do is actually to use another node that helps us to map or resize the textures without scaling out of the bounds of this image or whatever image is projected. So I'm just going to Ctrl Z. And while we have this UV map still constrained in this image over here, we'll talk about another node. We're going to come to any plane area here, Shift A to add, And this time we want to look at the input node that talks about texture coordinate. Remember that I talked about the fact that textures are actually 2D images. Now 2D images are flat and they have the dimension of a square, for example, or a rectangle. And the idea is you have your length and breadth, whether it is your y-axis or your x-axis. And the y and x-axis is represented with u and v, and that's why we have UV maps. So the idea is we want to get the texture coordinates or the dimension of the texture and map it into something that will help us to resize it without deforming or rescaling this UV map. So the next node we're going to look at is a mapping node. Now this is actually a vector node. So we're going to go over to a plain space and go to click Shift A. And once you click Shift A, we're going to look for the vector node. So once you click on that, you can go up and you see mapping. And once you click on mapping, you now have your mapping node. Like I said earlier, we have textures in U and V. Is actually our X and Y axis. And we want to convert the UV coordinate to vector coordinate, a 3-point coordinate, that is X, Y, and Z. To do so, we're going to take the UV socket and plug it into the vector socket. Now we're not going to be able to see anything that is happening until we plug it to the rest of the node and create a network. So what I will do is I will go to the mapping vector socket over here, click on it and drag it to the vector socket over here for the picture. Now if you notice, it's just reloaded, nothing happened, but whatever action we now take, we're going to be able to see it in this projection over here. So let's go back to scaling up the textures. I'm going to go to this mapping node here where you see scale. And now we have the X, Y, and Z coordinates as 1 unit. And I can rescale it to, let's say, 2 units. And once I click enter, you can see that it actually rescaled. It's best practice to rescale, your textures to be the same dimension for the X, Y, and Z. So we'll do, 2 for all the coordinates over here. So we can see that the wooden object, so to say, or the texture, it's now looking thinner based on the scaling. However, we still have the UV maps constrained to that image without, rescaling it in this UV editor. I think we're learning a lot. So one more thing is we can, decide to organize our files or our nodes rather as we work. So you can click on this, drag and select everything. And once you right click, you can see join in new frame. And once you click on join in new frame, we can now tell anyone that uses this file that this particular setup is just for mapping. We can decide to rename that frame by right clicking on any empty space there and click on rename, and let's call this mapping. And now anybody that comes to use this file will know that this node setup is just for the mapping. I should also mention that Blender by default uses the metric system, and we can find that by going over to this icon over here, the scene properties panel, and you'll be able to see the unit system. This is important, especially if you're using real world data. You'll be able to set the unit system to whatever you desire. So we're going to leave it at this metric system because for the next course coming, the software we'll be using will also work with the metric system, and that's what we'll talk about. That's working with Unity. Now we have introduced the base color texture map. The base color texture map is also called albedo or diffuse. So anywhere you see those words, they are actually interchangeable.